your mics and cameras. Honorable guest speaker, dear faculty, staff, and students, Assalamu alaikum and good morning. I, Faiza Azhar Khan, welcome you to this webinar on post-budget 2021-22 analysis organized by Department of Economics, Fatima Jinnah Women University, Rawalpindi. We'll formally start the webinar with the name of Allah, the Beneficent and the Merciful.
In the name of Allah, the entirely merciful, the especially merciful. Indeed, we sent the Quran down during the night of decree. And what can make you know what is the night of decree? The night of decree is better than 1,000 months. The angels and the Spirit descend therein by permission of their Lord for every matter. Peace it is until the emergence of dawn.
Jazakallah. Dear audience, today's webinar is specifically organized to deliberate on Federal Budget 2021-2022. Federal Budget for the fiscal year 2022 was presented on June 11 with a total outlay of approximately 8.4 trillion rupees. GDP growth target has been set at 4.8%, while national PSDP outlay is set at 2102 billion rupees. No new tax is imposed on salaried class and minimum wage is set to be 20,000 rupees. Is this budget people friendly, and what is going to be its impact on the economy? This and many such questions are going to be answered in this webinar. Dear colleagues, it is our honor and privilege to have Professor Dr. Hafeez Pasha as the guest speaker for today's webinar on federal budget. Professor Dr. Hafeez Pasha is a renowned economist and policy expert. He has been the chairman of the Planning Commission's panel of economists and currently serving as Professor Emeritus at the Beacon House National University, Lahore. Earlier, Professor Pasha was UN Assistant Secretary General and Director of the Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific of UNDP for a period of 6 years. He has also served as the Federal Commerce Minister, Federal Minister for Finance and Economic Affairs, and Education Minister in 3 governments. Sir, it is an absolute privilege to have you with us. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Dr. Hafeez Pasha to deliver his talk. Sir.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dr. Faiza Azhar, Dr. Busha, Yasmin, other members of the faculty and students of the university, I am really grateful for the opportunity to speak to a very enlightened group of faculty and students at the Fatima Jinnah Women University. Once in a while, I have been invited to speak, and I must say I've thoroughly enjoyed the interaction with the faculty and the students at the Women's University. Now, as Dr. Faiza Azhar has indicated, this budget represents a very bold and perhaps ambitious attempt at trying to use fiscal policy in particular to promote the growth process in Pakistan. Fortunately, it turned out that the year which is about to come to an end, we were able to approach a growth rate of nearly 4%, but a large part of that was due to the low base effect of last year. So now the real challenge is to genuinely achieve a growth rate of close to 5%. Officially, the target's been set at 4.8%. So how is this expansionary fiscal policy going to work? First of all, let me give you some orders of magnitude. The first is, as Dr. Faiza has indicated, the size of this budget is close to 8.4, almost 8.5 trillion rupees. So this is a very large budget. And what is very important is, please note that it represents a growth rate of 17% over the estimated expenditure last year. So this is a fairly rapid growth, and it's very unusual because in the last 4 or 5 years, we have targeted for an increase in the size of the budget, which is somewhat smaller than the increase in the size of the GDP. But this year, we are expecting the GDP to go up by about something like 13%, but expenditure, the budget size, as indicated by the expenditure, is expected to rise by 17%. So this is an ambitious budget, and it raises a number of issues. First, how is this expenditure going to be used? And how will it contribute to the process of growth and poverty alleviation? And perhaps one of the most fundamental issues will be, how will this big budget with a very large increase be financed? Because the concern we always have had is that when you try and expand the size of your expenditures, you run into a problem of growing budget deficits, and that leads to borrowings, which contribute to a rapid increase in the public debt. So is this budget going to avoid this kind of a difficult situation, where in an effort to raise the spending, are we going to see a big increase in the fiscal deficit, which will have, among other things, bad inflationary consequences? Now, how is this expenditure of 8.4 trillion rupees likely to be distributed? First, of course, is the obligations that the country and the federal government has to meet in current expenditure. And so therefore, within current expenditure, the focus is going to be very much on trying to mobilize resources for the critical heads. Before we get to the spending on other types of expenditure, the first preemption of budgetary resources is by debt servicing. By now, unfortunately, debt servicing has become the largest single claimant on the federal budget. 20 years ago, it used to be development spending. 10 years ago, it was defense spending. And now it is spending on servicing our debt obligations in the form of interest payments. So out of this budget of 8,400 billion or so, almost 3,100 billion will go towards interest payments on outstanding domestic and external debt. So that kind of preempts already, if you like, something like 30-35% of our budget. Then the other second big head is defense services. And in this, we are targeting this year for something just under 1,400 billion rupees. The important thing to note is that government is, despite showing an overall 17% growth in spending, is hoping to economize significantly on debt servicing and defense services. Debt servicing is expected to grow by hardly 4%. While defense services, and I must give due credit to the military establishment for the last 2-3 years, they have not been asking for big increases in their budgets. And for the next year too, the increase is only 6%. So the two big heads, which combined eat up half or more of the budget, are going to, we hope, or the government hopes, will show only modest growth. So that leaves a big amount of fiscal space for three things. The first is running of civil government, which otherwise would cost us about 500 billion rupees. But now the good news for the government employees is that in March they got a 25% increase allowances. This time they've got another 10% increase in their allowances and a 10% increase in pensions. So that means that the cost of running the civil government will go up by about 30 to 35% next year. So a significant part of the fiscal space is going to be now devoted to remunerating better our civil servants and employees who have had to bear the brunt of inflation, because the last time there was a salary increase, that was in 2018-19. Then, of course, the good news. Out of the remaining fiscal space, we have now that grants are going to be expanded very rapidly, and they're going to increase by 29%. A significant part of the grants go towards helping various segments of our society, and I will discuss them in some detail later on when I get on to the issue of the impact on the poor of the budget. Then subsidies traditionally also have played a role in helping different segments of society. And this year they're going to be increased by, believe it or not, almost 226%. This is a phenomenal increase. And the reason why that is happening also, I will indicate to you shortly. Perhaps the most dramatic and wonderful increase that we see in our budget, federal budget, is the phenomenal expansion in development spending. It is going to be increased from about 1,400 billion this year of the federal and the provincial governments combined. It is going to be increased, inshallah, to 2,100 billion rupees. This is an unbelievable 50% increase. This is perhaps the single most powerful weapon that the government proposes to use to bolster the GDP growth rate. So this, in a summary, is in fact the priorities and the growth strategy in the federal budget. And let me very quickly point out to you that we have seen over the last 2 days, 2 provincial budgets also being announced with almost exactly the same strategy and philosophy. The provincial government of Punjab hopes to achieve almost a 40 to 50% increase in their development spending. Sindh is even more ambitious and is targeting for over a 60% increase in spending. So this really is in some sense the framework of the budget, and how large is the budget deficit going to be? The first estimate is that after transferring resources to the provinces, the federal government will be left with something like 3,400 billion from its revenues, and it will therefore end up with having something like a budget deficit of 4,000 billion rupees. This is a surprisingly large budget deficit. It adds up to 7.3% of the GDP, And this year, the fiscal deficit, we estimate, is going to close at about 7.5 to 7.7% of the GDP. So this is not the year when the government is targeting for a big deficit reduction at the federal level. And if we are optimistic, then it's going to fall from, say, 7.7 to 7.3, which is a very small decline. Traditionally, the targeting has been always for 1 to 1.5% reduction of the GDP in the deficit. But this year, it is clear the government's pursuing an expansionary fiscal policy and is willing to forego for some time the target of substantial deficit reduction. However, the government is relying on the provincial governments to come in with a significant provincial cash surplus of almost 570 billion rupees, which is exactly 1% of the projected GDP, and thereby bring the combined deficit down to 6.3% of the GDP from about 7.1% of the GDP likely this year. How is the financing of this gap going to take place? By and large, as always, the reliance will be on domestic borrowing of possibly up to 2.5 trillion rupees, and the remainder will come from foreign net borrowing. And interestingly, there is now a new target, an ambitious target yet again, on privatization receipts of almost 250 billion rupees. So now that we have the key magnitudes of the proposed federal budget, let us begin to see what are likely to be its macroeconomic consequences. The first thing to look at is what are the implications of the tax revenue target that has been set. The FBR is the principal source of revenues to the federal government. Needless to say, it is expected that the revenues of FBR will go up from about 4,700 billion to over 5,800 billion next year. This is a phenomenal increase of 24%. Unfortunately, we have never in our history achieved a growth rate of 24% in FBR revenues. The closest we have come was in 2015-16, when we saw a growth rate of 21%. So can we therefore begin to conclude that this target of FBR is on the optimistic side? But of course, it will not be if there is a heavy dose of additional taxation. Now, when you look at the way the growth has been computed, normally what happens is that revenues increase when the economy grows without any additional taxation. The tax bases expand. The two big tax bases of Pakistan are, of course, the rupee imports and the rupee value of manufacturing, large-scale manufacturing production. These are your two principal tax bases. Next year, we are targeting for a 6% growth in manufacturing and possibly a 7 to 8% growth in the dollar value of imports. Based on that, the government is saying that because the economy is going to grow at 4.8% and they are projecting a rate of inflation of 8.2%, they are inclined to conclude that normal growth in FBR revenues without any additional taxation would be close to 13%, which takes FBR revenues from 4,700 billion close to 5,300 billion. So what is required in additional taxation is about 500 billion. The government has announced initially 386 billion of additional taxation, but took back the excise duty levied on mobile phones, which was going to yield a large amount of 100 billion. And now the net revenue yield from new taxes is expected to be 286 billion rupees, and they are anticipating that the remainder requirement of 214 billion will come through administrative improvements and attempts at broadening the tax base in terms of taxation of the retail sales sector. In my own humble view, this is somewhat on the optimistic side. Normal growth does not always equate with the growth in the GDP. For example, in 2018-19, our GDP grew nominally by 11%, but revenues collapsed by 4%. So there is this problem that it depends on exactly how fast large-scale manufacturing grows, and do the sectors within large-scale manufacturing sector which have a higher tax incidence grow faster, for example, cement, for example, petroleum products, and so on and so forth. Then within imports, which items grow fast? Again, petroleum product imports and other imports like transport equipment and so on. So it depends on the nature, not only on the extent of growth, but on the nature of growth. So we have to be a bit cautious about assuming a normal growth of 13%. My own calculations are that it will be about 10%. So that 10% should take us to about 5,200. And if we begin to, I've spent my life looking at budgets, and there's always this wonderful residual statement that inshallah, inshallah, administrative improvements will give us 200 billion. It never happens. So the end result is that we will probably end up with 10% increase due to normal growth and about 280 odd billion due to the additional taxation. So that will give us take us very close to 5,500 and leave a gap of about 300 billion. Now, what are those tax measures going to yield, which are going to yield 280 billion? The reliance, interestingly, is on primarily energy-related taxation. 2.5% levy on crude oil, 17% levy of sales tax on crude oil, an increase in RLNG import sales tax from 12 to 15%, and the third item, of course, tends to be natural gas and other items. And interestingly, there is a proposal also now to increase the sales tax on ginned cotton. The problem with taxing inputs like cotton or RLNG or crude oil is that this leads to a situation where there is overall no net increase in revenue, because you collect the revenue at the initial stage of value added, but you have to return it back in the form of input tax invoicing at the next stage of value added. So the end result is very little net increase in revenues. All that happens is that you get them faster. So if this 286 billion includes a significant component of reliance on the sales tax increases on energy inputs, then I'm afraid that's not going to yield very much revenue. I have 2 or 3 serious objections about some of the proposals. One is, for God's sake, why are you trying to now tax sugar on its retail price? It's already hopelessly overpriced. The common man is having difficulties. Why in the world would you want to tax a food item like sugar is not clear. And the other thing which is also not clear to me is why we have focused so much on the energy taxation. Turning to one other area of taxation, which is even perhaps more serious and worrying, is the proposal to generate 610 billion from the Petroleum Levy. Good God. Currently, our Petroleum Levy, which about 6 to 8 months ago used to be 30 rupees per liter, and this was at the time when there was a slump in the price of oil globally, down to $25–30 a barrel. The government used the decline to generate more revenues through the petroleum levy. But over the last few weeks and months, the price of oil has shot up exponentially. Currently, it's at over $72 a barrel. And in the interim, what the government has had to do to keep the price stable, to reduce drastically the petroleum levy, which is now down from 30 rupees per litre to between 5 to 7 rupees per litre. What is completely not comprehensible is why the government, given already that the base import prices are sky high, yet the government wants to bring back the petroleum levy to 30 rupees per litre once again. God forbid, this will imply an increase of 25 to 30% in oil prices within Pakistan, especially in high-speed diesel oil and in motor spirit, or petrol as we frequently call it. This is to say, from the viewpoint of inflation, extremely worrying. This alone increase in tax. Over the year, I have computed directly and indirectly through a rise in transport costs will add 2.5 percentage points to the inflation rate in the country. And of course, it will be hopelessly regressive in incidence because a large part of basic food products and other items have a significant component of transport cost. And if transport cost is going up by 25 to 30%, you can imagine what will be the indirect, widespread impact on food prices and prices of other basic commodities. So overall, not a very high quality resource mobilization strategy. I'm inclined as a professor to say this borders anywhere between C+ and possibly no more C+. Now we come to the issue of under budgeting. As I told you, you see, the problem is I've been inside the Ministry of Finance for some time as the Ministry of Finance, so I know what kind of things happen in the ministry and how certain figures are played with, just to show a somewhat better picture. And I think you, as the citizens of Pakistan, need to know what we think is the reality. There is no way in the world that debt servicing is going to increase by only 4%. Do you know that between 2017-18 and this year, which is about to come to an end, in a period of 3 years, they have doubled from 1,500 billion to 3,000 billion. And now suddenly the Ministry of Finance turns around and says, don't worry, this is it, only 4% more growth next year. This is an absurdly low growth rate. At the minimum, it will be 10 to 11%. So there's an under budgeting here of at least 200 billion rupees, just because they want to show a diversion to other heads. Defense spending, voila, 6% growth, which in real terms is a decline. Unfortunately, the regional situation has become much more complicated with the American exit from Afghanistan, and we're going to have a lot of border problems and so on. And unfortunately, the terrorism incidents in Balochistan, just literally a day or two ago, we've had an incident, has increased a lot. So internal security will have to be given much greater priority, like we did in 2015-16 with Zarb-e-Azb, which I salute the military and the Frontier Constabulary and others for having done a remarkable job at that time of having brought down terrorism. But at that time, we had to increase the military budget by 20 to 25% at least. Something similar may have to happen for very good reasons, for genuine reasons, for legitimate reasons. We want our country to be safe and secure, and at this time, this is of paramount importance. So these two heads combined, additional spending could be as much as 500 billion. So what happens then? Inevitably, the first casualty when you spill over on the current expenditure side is development spending. At this point in time, you're proposing to spend 700 billion more on development spending, taking it from 1,400 billion to 2,100 billion, 50% increase, but you may have to cut this down by 300 or more billion because of the enhanced outlay that you will have to make on debt servicing and defense. Hopefully, the two allocations which directly or indirectly impact on the poor are grants and subsidies, and within running of civil government, an item called social protection. Now, this is where I come now to the poverty dimension, anti-poverty dimension of our budget. Social protection has been budgeted at a very significant amount for the first time, and I'm very pleased to see this, at 260 odd billion. Within grants, unfortunately, the prime eater of these grants, consumer of these grants, are your network of state-owned enterprises. They are sucking in money from the budget because they're running into huge budget, their own budget deficits. In fact, you will be perhaps surprised to know that the federal government has to guarantee the debt that these SOEs like PIA, railways, NHA, so on and so forth, these big entities take to finance literally the salaries of their staff and so on, because they have huge deficits. Believe it or not, this guaranteed debt has spiraled up to over 1,800 billion rupees. This is, in a sense, the cumulative borrowing of our so-called state-owned enterprises. Last year alone, shocking, 27% increase in guaranteed debt. Almost half your grants now or more will be preempted by these bottomless pit of state-owned enterprises. So you're left with very little to be able to do other types of grants. And the other major destination of our grants are the special territories, Azad Jammu and Kashmir, and of course, Gilgit-Baltistan. And now, fortunately for us, FATA has been merged into Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and so Khyber Pakhtunkhwa has the responsibility of supporting the running of government operations in FATA, and there is, of course, a way that they are compensated for it through other mechanisms. So the grants are largely preempted away. At this point in time, we have only about 260 billion, which has been allocated under running of civil government to social protection. And then we have the good news that within subsidies and grants, we have an allocation of roughly 250, slightly more billion of money for the Benazir Income Support Program. That is the official title for it. As per the accounting terminology, it of course means that this is the ESAS / BISP program. So combined, out of a budget of 8,400 billion, a total of only 500 billion rupees is targeted towards helping the relatively poor segments of our society. This is really very unfortunate. It's only about 6 to 7%. And I'm almost embarrassed to have to say this to you. So I am extremely disappointed about the size of the interventions that are being made to directly help the poor. I'll give you some examples of interventions which ought to have been made. Under pressure because of the fall in wheat output last year, the two provincial governments of Sindh and Balochistan raised combined the procurement price of wheat for this year's crop by 30%, from 1400 to 1800 and 2000 in Punjab, in Sindh. Is there a food subsidy? No. Instead, the number is not clear, but my initial understanding is that the number will remain restricted to 7 million families who will be the recipient of the ESAS cash transfers. Now, today in Pakistan, we have at least 16 million families that are below the poverty line. So what are the remaining many million families going to do to protect themselves, particularly from a rise in the staple food, which has already risen by about 20% this year, could rise by another 30%, God forbid. So that is my one big area of disappointment. The other is that the ESAS program, as I said, is targeting maybe a maximum of 7 million. It should have targeted the figure that was achieved last year. There was tremendous. I take my hat off to the government's efforts. Immediately after COVID, they did a remarkable job of trying to protect our poor. Both the government of Pakistan and the State Bank of Pakistan. Superb job of providing special packages, financing packages, special measures to alleviate the suffering. 15 million families were given cash transfer last year. The number of poor has not declined because the inflation in food prices is currently been operating at 15%. So I'm afraid the number of poor has remained more or less the same. And why in the world are you going to bring down the number of people who will be beneficiaries of cash transfers from 15 million last year to 7 million this year? I don't know. So to me, the budget is a big disappointment in terms of its efforts to alleviate poverty. Yes, it is a growth dynamic budget, and that too, if 50% growth takes place in the PSDB spending, I've now had to tell you that there may be a 300 billion cut, which will reduce it by 20%, but we will still have a growth of 30%, which is healthy, very good growth, provided there is implementation capacity. What we have seen in the last 2 years is breakdown in implementation capacity. There are a number of reasons for it. One is the quality of governance, and two, of course, the civil service frequently is worried about taking decisions on financial matters which may get them on the wrong side of the National Accountability Bureau. You'll be amazed that while the Punjab government has targeted next year for their own annual development program of 500 billion, they will hardly spend, in real terms, although they will claim more in the revised estimates, in real terms they will have spent hardly 250 billion. Whereas their target was 350 billion. So Punjab in particular is bogged down by a limited or increased lack of implementation capacity. And the other, of course, factor which is very important is that almost 85% of provincial revenues are federal transfers through the NFC award, 7th NFC. Huge reliance. And you know what has happened this year? Because the federal government has announced a 24% increase in FBR revenues, which is basically your divisible pool of revenues, the provinces have decided to go on a holiday as far as mobilizing their own revenues are concerned. So Punjab, tax-free budget, tax concessions on the sales tax and services has been announced. Wallah, at a time when we need more tax revenues, Punjab has decided to take a holiday. Sindh similarly has decided to take a holiday. And the end result is that if God forbid that 24%, as I told you, which is likely there to be a significant shortfall, if there is such a shortfall and the transfers do not get up to an increase of 24% and are limited to an increase of say 14, 15, 16% at best, then they will have to cut back their development programs. And also they've engaged, like the federal government, in enhancing the salaries and pensions, which was, as I said, all due. But in the process of doing that, do you know what is the cost to the public finances of Pakistan of raising salaries initially at the federal level by 25% allowance and now by 10% increase in pay and 10% increase in pensions at the federal level? And Sindh has gone to town, 25% increase, and Punjab has restricted it to 20% increase. This increase, if it happens in all the 4 provinces, plus the federal government, will only cost us an extra 500 billion rupees. I don't know how or to what extent this has been adequately budgeted for. Federal government has shown an extra provision of 160 billion, but the provincial budgets need to be looked at to see if they have explicitly provided for the increase in their salaries and pensions for provinces combined of 340 billion. So the government is taking care of its employees. But what has it done about the people at large? How are their incomes going to go up? We were told in the finance minister's press conference that at the time of presentation of the Pakistan Economic Survey just prior to the budget, that initially after COVID-19 hit Pakistan in late February last year, in the first 3-4 months, 20 million people had either lost their jobs, workers, or had suffered a loss in their incomes. A huge impact. Of course, he gave us the optimistic report from PBS that 17 million have gone back to their jobs by end December last year, which is, of course, with all due respects, a somewhat optimistic estimate. But there is no doubt that real wages have fallen dramatically in Pakistan, or even prior to COVID and certainly after COVID. So the wonderful consideration that for the first time after many years, the budgets include a formal announcement of increase in minimum wages. And what is the increase in minimum wages that has been reported? 20,000 in the case of the federal government, and Sindh, as I said, has gone to town and raised it to 25,000 from about 17,000. Wonderful, wonderful. But do you know what the tragic reality is? Surveys have revealed, the surveys of Pakistan Bureau of Statistics themselves on wages, that 53% of full-time workers who work 40 hours a week or more, 53% of the workers do not even get the minimum wage. We have minimum wage legislation, but it's not implemented. And the labor departments are so weak or so mixed up with the employer federations and so on, that our poor working class gets a very bad deal. So this minimum wage is only on paper. Unless the 4 provincial governments, labor has become a provincial subject after the 18th Amendment, really ensure that this minimum wage increase is fully implemented, it has no real significance in the lives of the people. So let me conclude. I've taken exactly 40 minutes. Let me conclude by saying the budget is ambitious, bold, but highly risky. It can lead to more inflation. It can have a bad impact on the lives of the people, particularly if the extent of interventions to provide relief remains so limited. And there is always the risk that because of the various things that are happening, including the rise in the petrol prices that are going to happen because of the budget, please let me tell you that the bottom line may be that the inflation rate rises somewhat to a significant double-digit rate. Let me conclude here, unfortunately, on not a very optimistic note, but we all pray and hope that our governments succeed because it's in the interest of the lives of our people, and that the 4.8% growth rate is achieved, and the government's target of 8.2% in inflation remains robust, and inflation remains single digit next year. Thank you very much, and I, of course, would look forward to some questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for such an interesting, informative, and emancipating talk. It was indeed a pleasure listening to your discussion on the budget. Dear audience, questions are welcome. Please raise your hand from the bar and wait for your turn. Okay, sir, Javeria from MPhil Economics is asking, according to new budget, our economy is growing in positive direction. Then why are we going for new loans to IMF? As debt and liabilities increased by the end of March 2021 to 45.47 trillion with a yearly increment of 6.2% already.
Can I take more than one question? Maybe take 2 or 3 questions and answer them together?
Okay, sir, we are waiting for the questions either in the chat box or if the student raised the hand.
Okay, then maybe I can answer this first question. Why are we having to go to the IMF at this time? Actually, I would be the last person to recommend going to the IMF, but sometimes what happens is that you have lived way beyond your means and you have run into deficits. You see, the focus when you talk about the IMF has to be on our external transactions and not on the domestic aspect like the budget and so on. Now, what is the external position of Pakistan? The external position of Pakistan today is that our external debt has risen quite sharply over the last decade or so. And today it stands at $119 billion. And if your GDP is about 280, you can imagine that this is over 40% of the economy. Excuse me. Second, even more worrying is that your annual debt repayment next year of external debt is going to rise dramatically because many of the loans are beginning to mature, particularly commercial bank loans, which we took a few years earlier, some of the loans that we have taken from the Chinese, and so on and so forth. So this year from $8 billion likely, suddenly next year, your debt servicing of external debt goes up to $12 billion. Then there is some good news, which is that fortunately, our current account deficit, which had attained an all-time peak of $20 billion in 2017-18, fortunately now has been in surplus for the first 10 months of this year, which is a remarkable achievement of the government. I take my hat off. But they've had to suffocate the economy to achieve that kind of containment of the current account deficit. But next year, look what's going to happen. Oil prices have risen from an average of about 45 this year to 72 already, and all the projections are as the world economy revives, because vaccine use has spread so rapidly in the Western world that they are now more or less immunized from. They have attained, as they call, herd immunity. So the world economy is going to rise very fast. And as it rises fast, don't be too surprised if your oil price attains a new peak. That alone can raise your oil import bill by $3 to $4 billion. Then the other factor is that between July last year and April this year, for which we have data, import prices of food items have gone up. And this was highlighted by the finance minister in his press conference. For example, palm oil is a major import of Pakistan for making vegetable ghee. That has gone up by 50%. So the risk now is that coming year, the current account deficit will be back in deficit and could be a deficit of $6 to $7 billion. End result, how much external financing do you need? Minimum $12 billion to repay your debt obligations, outstanding debt, and $6 to $7 billion as current account deficit, close to $18 to $19 billion. Who is going to lend $18 to $19 billion to a country which today has marginal credit ratings and is considered somewhat? In fact, the Economist Intelligence Unit some time ago in its assessment of Asian countries had identified 3 countries. I'm sorry, I have to say this because I have to be an honest person. I'm quoting them. They said 3 countries are prone to default. Mongolia, on the northeastern part of Asia. Sri Lanka, our neighbor downstairs, and Pakistan. So we need the umbrella and the cover of the International Monetary Fund, because that is a lender of last resort. But let me also say that the IMF has tried to bully us, has acted as a bully in the last review, and at one time has asked for so many things: rise in power tariffs, rise in taxes, rise in energy prices, rise everywhere. No government has the political or implementation capacity to implement such a tough agenda of reforms at the same time. I don't know how the government signed off initially, and there was cabinet approval. And then, of course, the new finance minister, who is very dabang, mashallah, he's like the old Shami Kapoor of India. He has said, no, we are not going to do all this. So the dabang finance minister says, no. So now we have the question, will the IMF program continue? I leave it up to the government. It's a sovereign entity. If they don't want to yield, they don't want to yield. But then they should have a fallback plan to ensure that they have $18 to $19 billion in the kitty, and that countries like China, as always, will come to our support and sweetly and in a very friendly manner will roll over all our debt obligations. And then we can say, Uncle IMF, bye, 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 bye. So we need the IMF for that reason. Unfortunately, it is linked to external debt obligations, not to anything necessarily to do with the domestic budget.
Thank you very much, sir. Sir, the next question is by Mrs. Mara Mushtaq. Her question is, if GDP is going to increase, they must improve living standards of the poor people. But as taxes are going to increase, I guess he is mentioning the petrol levy, inflation will lift up, food prices or basic necessities will also, prices will also increase because of transportation costs, so poor will remain poor. Then for poor citizen, how higher GDP or how this budget is a relief?
I'm sorry to say that if there is some relief, it is not on the prices side. If there is some modicum of relief, it will be in higher employment. And that employment will only come if the public sector development program of the federal government and the provincial governments. Currently, it is budgeted to increase by at least 50%. If it even increases by 25 to 30%, that will contribute significantly, both directly and indirectly through the fiscal multiplier, which you're all familiar with, to more jobs. So I see the budget as being more pro-jobs and unfortunately not beginning to even tackle the problem of high inflation. It may even cause more inflation over and above the impact of the petroleum levy hike. And that will happen if the fiscal deficit increases somewhat by, say, 0.5% of the GDP. That will mean roughly another, few hundred billion of deficit financing. Money supply could expand faster. And so on. From the demand side also, there could be some pressure on inflation. So this budget means hopefully more growth, more employment, but also unfortunately could mean more inflation. And therefore it nets out, and on a net basis for the majority of poor households, I don't see much of an improvement.
Sir, there is a related question by Ms. Madia that if oil prices will increase, that will increase all the commodity prices as well. Then why government has imposed this petrol levy and did not focus on the reducing the oil prices or keeping them the same?
Very good question. To me, what is the biggest failure, with all due respects to the ministry, which I've had once in my life an opportunity to guide. And I used to negotiate with the IMF. And once the IMF negotiator turned around and told me, Dr. Pasha, you quote so many statistics, I get confused. So I have to agree with what you say. Those were the days we used to rattle them with numbers and get a good deal. Unfortunately, it appears that this did not happen in February when the negotiations took place with the government, although Dr. Hafeez Sheikh was an old university mate of mine when I was Vice Chancellor of the University of Karachi. Okay, now the fundamental question, the answer is I could not agree more with the lady who has raised this question. What should have been done? There is no attempt at progressive income taxation in the budget. Let me tell you one or two shocking things, and maybe that will bring we'll have completed our 1 hour. The fundamental thing is the elite of Pakistan, the top 1%, or if you like, the top 2%, have an incredible deal in our tax laws. There's so many holes that have been left in legitimately in our tax laws that they have a wonderful time. Minimum tax liability. If somebody were to pick up the National Human Development Report 2020 of the United Nations, of which unfortunately the lead author was a person called Dr. Hafeez Pasha, he has quantified for the first time the tax breaks and concessions within the law given to our elite. Do you know how much they add up to? A sultry only 1,600 billion rupees. 1,600 billion rupees. Can't we take 600 to 700 billion rupees back from the extremely rich, well-endowed people of our country who Pakistan has gone out of its way to make them rich, and transfer the 600 to 700 billion in the form of various interventions for our poor? This has not happened. I gave a presentation to the Honorable Prime Minister, who used to be talking to me economics when I was Vice Chancellor of the University of Karachi, and he had started his political career. So I gave him a full presentation on the gifts to the rich within the law, Not that there is evasion or anything, is what is legitimate gifts. And every minute or so he would say, Dr. Saab, very good, very good. Very good. This was in September last year, and I was hoping that much of it would find its way into the budget this year. How many items came in the budget on progressive taxation? 0. I'll give you one small example, very, very minor example, and I'll stop here because we are approaching the end of the event. Do you know what is the income at which a personal taxpayer, income taxpayer, an individual has to begin to pay at the margin the highest tax rate? Guess what that income level has to be before he begins to pay 30 to 35%. Only 7 crores 50 lakhs. If his income reaches that level annually, 7 crores 50 lakhs, does he have to worry about for the additional rupee to pay 30 paisas, 35 paisas? How many people earn 7 crore 50 lakhs in this country? I wish I did. I would gladly pay 35%. In India and in Bangladesh, the equivalent maximum rate is charged Pakistani rupees 10 million. And here we have given a gift to the rich. Don't worry, as long as you're making 7 crores 50 lakhs 75 million rupees, no higher tax rate on you. Highest tax rate will not apply on you. So these are the kinds of, I wanted to use the word horrible, but unacceptable tax breaks given to the rich. The time has come for Pakistan to move decisively towards progressive taxation, and for God's sake, stop taxing items. Imagine you're going to tax the retail price of sugar today. Is this something to do? Price of sugar has gone up to over 100 rupees. So I completely agree with the questioner that we should not have raised the petroleum levy and thereby led to inflation down the road in the next few months. Instead, my own humble recommendation was go for more progressive taxation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Sir, if you have some time, we have 2 more questions. Dr. Malak Ghulam Behlol wanted to ask, what about education allocation? Either we are going to come across any tangible interventions in terms of economic measures, or will be only lip service for education? What are your suggestions to universities for financial sustainability?
A very good question and very relevant to the sector which we all belong to. I'll ask Dr. Saab to go to the chapter on health and education and the chapters in the Pakistan Economic Survey. And I will also ask him to look at a table which shows the pro-poor allocations of expenditure. And education is shown clearly as a pro-poor expenditure. And what horrifies me is that in 2019-20, the federal and the provincial governments reduced their education spending in Pakistan at current prices by over 10, almost, I don't want to quote that figure, by about 10%. How could you reduce the expenditure on education by 10%? Did you sack the teachers? Did you close down already? In the last 5 years, we have closed down 17,000 schools, public schools. Are you now closing colleges? Are you now closing secondary schools? How can, in nominal terms, forget real terms, in nominal terms, education spending come down in Pakistan in 2019-20 by the federal and the provincial governments combined, most of it by the provincial governments? For God's sake, we were spending hardly 2% of our GDP on education. Now it's down probably to 1.8%. The lowest in South Asia. Even Bangladesh spends 3% of its GDP. Bangladesh, by the way, now is a golden country as far as we are concerned. They've gone way beyond us. In this budget, what is the provision? Hopefully, Punjab government at least has shown and given the right signal. They have increased their education budget dramatically. I hope they can finance it, and that will only happen if the federal transfers remain as targeted, which is somewhat unlikely. But nevertheless, the priority has been given to education by the government of Punjab, and I salute them. I don't see the same priority in Sindh, unfortunately, at these two budgets that have come out. At the federal level, the big issue is Higher Education Commission budget. And the last 2 years, the federal government has shown no growth in the budgetary allocations for Higher Education Commission. And today, your public universities, many of them are bordering on being bankrupt. You know, there have been demonstrations in KPK and universities that people are not being paid their pensions. I know my own university, of which I used to be the vice chancellor, the largest university, University of Karachi. In my time, we had enough money to pay pensions and so on and so forth. Now the vice chancellor tells me that he's having difficulty not only in paying pensions, but also in paying the full salaries. So the public sector universities are in deep trouble, and the time has now come. You see, higher education essentially, according to the 18th Amendment, is largely a provincial subject. The only role that the federal government is supposed to play, according to the 18th Amendment, is in regulatory standards. HEC is supposed to be a regulatory body and not a financing body. But it has become the principal source of financing. The provinces like it because they don't have to carry any liability. The time has come, very clearly, the Council of Common Interests has to say at least 50-50 sharing in financing of public higher education. Otherwise, our public universities will collapse and the quality of education will wither away sooner than later.
Thank you very much, sir. Sir, the last question is by Ms. Saira Tufail. Her question is, as budget may lead to more inflation, does this imply that monetary policy effectiveness will be deteriorated in coming quarters?
Excellent question. Very good question. And the issue is the interaction between fiscal and monetary policies. Notice that on the monetary policy side, the government is kind of trying to preempt it by promising very large numbers of small loans at low interest rates for housing and other purposes. Good move. But the bottom line is, will the commercial banks be willing to do all this? What is there in it for them? The costs of transacting small loans are so high for our extremely well endowed and rich commercial banks who can rely solely on buying government bonds and making 15% return without any risk. Why would they want to take the risk of lending to the poor? So the issue is, will the state bank follow the instructions in the federal budget and ensure that these instructions which have come in the budget are strictly adhered to by the commercial banks? If they do, well and good. Then you will see a spreading out of the credit mechanism. Today, you will be horrified to know that the 3 million SMEs of Pakistan, 3 million SMEs of Pakistan get a share of 6% in total credit. 6%, sharam aani chahiye. Then there is, of course, if the IMF program continues and inflationary pressures start building up, whether they are cost push or demand pull, sooner or later, Uncle IMF will turn around and say, Uncle will say, बेटे अब जरा डिमांड को कंट्रोल करना है तो ऐसा करो कि इंटरेस्ट रेट्स को 2-3 परसेंटेज पॉइंट बढ़ा दो बेटे, वरना तो इन्फ्लेशन विल इफेक्ट इन हर चीज बढ़ जाएगी। तो हम अंकल आईएमएफ से क्या नो कहेंगे? मुझे तो परेशानी ये है कि either way, without the fund program, with the fund program, we are in trouble. So God save us. Unfortunately, let me conclude on this very sad note and say that I've really enjoyed this session with, my life has revolved around students. And I'm extremely happy that I got some wonderful questions, some very good participation, Dr. Faiza, Dr. Bushra, and others. Thank you very much for a wonderful budget-related webinar.
Thank you very much, sir. The pleasure is ours. I would like to invite Dr. Bushra Yasmeen, coordinator for the webinar and associate professor, Department of Economics, and faculty advisor, Faculty of Arts and Social Science, Fatima Jinnah Women University, for her concluding remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Faiza. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. It's always a pleasure listening to you. Thank you so much. Because actually I was reading so many articles and newspaper reviews on the budget, and that were highly optimistic and were regarding the budget highly promising, and we actually need a critical appraisal of the budget that is very well served today. Thank you so much. Now we know that if there are some good things, there are bad as well. And yes, and thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Bushra. As always, you've been a great colleague. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Sir, if you give us 1 minute, so we have to take a picture.
Yes, certainly.
Yes. And thank you all for joining us. If you turn on your camera.
Thank you ever so much.
Yes. Please, if you turn on your camera, whoever want, and we will take a quick picture. Just quickly, if you turn on your camera. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Adra.
Thank you, goodbye, and wish you all the best for the next coming year. And I hope you don't have to pay too much for your petrol. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Good Hafeez. Good Hafeez.
Good Hafeez.